Yes,
And you were the FTO. Where were you seated in the car?
in the passenger seat.
And tell the jury what you remember about first seeing the white Buick on that day, approximately 2 p.m. And talk slowly.
Officer Lucky and I were driving south on Zane Avenue North. We were talking about pursuit policies, doing some regular FTO training, and he observed a vehicle in the turn lane with a blinker on inappropriately.
And was that the white Buick?
Yes.
And did you have a conversation with him about that?
Yes.
And what was that conversation?
We discussed a little bit of suspicious activity. He noticed a pine tree or air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and the tabs were expired.
And did you stop that vehicle?
Officer Lucky wanted to stop the vehicle, yes.
And let me ask you sort of a hypothetical. If you had been working alone that day on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, would you have stopped the vehicle for...
Objection, relevance, false or speculation.
I can't even finish the question, Your Honor.
All right.
That's not fair. They know how to try a lawsuit, I would
Okay.
think.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
My question was, if you weren't with a field training officer that day and you were on patrol alone, would you have stopped that vehicle?
Most likely not.
And why not?
An air freshener to me it's just an equipment violation. And during the COVID times, the high COVID times, the Department of Motor Vehicles was so offline that people weren't getting tabs, and we were advised not to try to enforce a lot of those things because the tabs were just not in circulation.
Okay. But you did stop the vehicle, right?
Yes, part of field training is that my probationer would make numerous contacts with the public throughout the day.
And what happened after the stop? If you remember, go ahead.
Before Officer Lucky stopped the car, he ran the vehicle, confirmed that the registration was expired and that the registered owner had a petty misdemeanor type warrant for some type of drug offense.
And that was the registered owner of the vehicle?
Yes.
So you did that while you were still in the squad car and not...
Yes, it's part of the multitasking that a probationer will have to do is run a vehicle license plate, call into dispatch, and initiate their lights.
Okay, and try and talk a little slower. I know you're probably nervous, but I'd like to get all this in. All right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you stopped the vehicle, is that right?
Officer Lucky initiates the traffic stop.
And what happened after he did that?
The vehicle stopped kind of in an entrance to the church on 63rd, and he got on the PA and told the vehicle to pull ahead just a short distance.
Was that because he was parked in the driveway of the...
Yeah, and I think there was a vehicle trying to come out, as I recall.
Okay. What happened next?
Officer Lucky and I exited our marked squad car. Officer Lucky walked up to the driver's door, and I stood at the right rear corner of the white Buick.
So you did get out of the car.
Most definitely.
And why did you stand where you were standing?
Part of it was so I could see where Officer Lucky was, and to provide cover to see what else was in the vehicle.
In your experience of 26 years and being a patrol officer all those years, is stopping any vehicle at any time that you don't know, does that be considered a dangerous situation?
Yes.
Why?
Sometimes there's guns in the car, sometimes there's uncooperative people. You don't know who you're stopping.
Yeah, because you don't know, right?
Right.
So, while you were standing there in the rear of the vehicle, did you hear what Officer Lucky said?
I could hear parts of the conversation. He didn't seem to be in any distress when he was asking questions. He took out his notepad, and it looked like he was writing down something which would end up being a name and a date of birth.
Okay, and after he did that, did you two go back to the squad car?
Yes.
And at some point in time during the stop or right after it, did Officer Lucky do anything in connection with obtaining another squad car?
Yes, he called for a second car to come.
What is that about? What?
It would just be a backup officer. The registered owner had a warrant of some nature. It wasn't a bad warrant. It was just a regular petty warrant, which would still, you'd want a second officer. Or I guess in this case, a third officer. Officer Lucky and I are considered only one officer.
And why are you and Lucky just one officer?
Because he's in field training and he's a probationary employee.
All right. So, did the third officer, Officer Johnson, arrive at some point in time?
Yes, Sergeant Johnson arrived.
And was that before you looked up in the computer about this driver of the vehicle, or after?
I don't know exactly when he arrived. I know Officer Lucky and I were discussing running the name he was given through some various systems.
Okay, and did you do that, you and Officer Lucky?
Yes.
Was there any correction that you told him about during this time that he shouldn't have put the name in one?
He had gone to the Minnesota, because the driver didn't provide him with any government-issued ID, he would have had to verify some information to run him properly in our system through TriTech. So you run them sometimes through Minnesota DVS with just a name and a date of birth. It'll give you a Soundex hit on various people with that either same name or common name with a date of birth.
So did you correct him on that?
We were talking about, I don't know if I corrected him on it, but
So what happened after that?
he would copy the OLN, which is a driver's license number, off the screen and then put it into our TriTech system, or CAD, and that would run him through the state for driver's license and warrants and other hits.
And did you find anything about the driver?
The driver came back with a suspended driver's license, gross misdemeanor, bench warrant for weapons, and a protection order.
So a gross misdemeanor for weapons ordinance, what went through your mind, if anything, when you read that?
It would be concerning that there'd be a weapon on the person or in the vehicle.
And why would that be?
In my experience over 26 years, I have found guns in cars, either by accident or by them just sitting out in plain view.
And what about a person with a weapons warrant?
They're more likely to be carrying a weapon or have a weapon access to them.
So what about the was it a temporary restraining order that came up? Was that it?
Yeah, I think they're called ex parte orders. It would be a temporary protection order until the parties would either have a court hearing in front of a judge to make it a permanent order.
And there would be a name of a female on that?
Yes, there was.
And was there a female in the Buick or in the automobile that was stopped?
Yeah, in the front. Yes, in the front passenger seat.
So after you learned that, did you also learn something? Did Officer Lucky tell you something about drugs or marijuana?
When he initially got back to the car, he told me there was a obvious smell of marijuana and some seedlings or shake residue on the center console and inside the vehicle.
Okay. So with all of that information, what did you do next?
We told Officer Lucky explained to Sergeant Johnson what was going on. I corrected.
Where was Sergeant Johnson? Was he in your squad car?
He was standing at my passenger door.
Go ahead.
And Officer Lucky was explaining to Sergeant Johnson what was happening and what he wanted to do. Officer Lucky only told Sergeant Johnson that he had a warrant, and I told Officer Lucky that he needed to tell Sergeant Johnson what the warrant was for. A weapons violation warrant would be cause for care and concern.
All right. And after that conversation, what happened, if anything, next?
We got out of the vehicle. Sergeant Johnson was going to the passenger side. And
Excuse me, don't mean to interrupt you. Back up a little, I'm getting ahead of me. What was the plan when you got out of your vehicle with Lucky and Johnson was outside? What was your plan?
The plan was for Officer Lucky to get the driver into custody for the warrant, and we'd further investigate with the female who she was and if she was the petitioner or the subject of the restraining order.
Were you required by policy and law in learning about that warrant to arrest the driver of that car?
Yes, it was an order of the court.
And with respect to the restraining order, or whatever you called it, did proper police procedure that you knew of for 26 years required to find out who that lady was?
Yes,
And why would that be?
it's my duty to find out who she is to make sure she's not in harm's way. There's been times when that hasn't happened and somebody has ended up killed because that wasn't followed.
So now we're at the Buick. It's a Buick car, white car. Is that
It's a
right?
white car.
And now we're at the white car, and you three went up to it, correct?
Yes, Sergeant Johnson went
Where,
up to the
where did
passenger
Johnson
side.
go?
He went up the passenger side to provide cover.
And what does provide cover mean? Is
Keep an eye on the occupants of the vehicle and just to monitor what's happening outside in the world. See if
And-
people are walking up on you or things go wrong.
and where were you located?
I was towards the left rear corner of the car.
And where was Officer Lucky?
He was advancing to the driver's door.
And how, by the way, before this, how long had you known Officer Lucky?
I think we were on our 5th shift.
And he was pretty new arrival, was he? Or,
I believe he was in second phase maybe, but he had been a police officer before.
okay, what does second phase mean?
He wasn't in his initial 4 weeks, he was in the start of his second 4 weeks.
And you testified you knew, at least back then, that he had come from another police department, correct?
Yes, I think he worked at 2 previous agencies and he was an explorer.
Okay. Now let's go back to when you three arrived at the white car. We've already said where you're located. Officer Lucky was at the driver's door, is that right?
Yes, he would have been standing behind the post between the driver's door and the rear passenger door.
What do you mean by that, standing behind the post?
He wouldn't have been directly in front of the door because that would be unsafe approach.
And this was this a warm day? Was the window down? Remember?
I don't know if the window was down or not.
Okay. But in any event, where were you standing again?
At the left rear corner.
And did you hear what Officer Lucky said?
Yes,
to-
I heard him ask the driver to step out of the vehicle a couple of times.
And did the driver step out of the vehicle finally?
Finally, he asked Officer Lucky a couple of times what was going on, and Officer Lucky said he would explain to him.
When he got out of the car?
Yes,
And so did the driver get out of the car?
yes.
And what do you remember happening next?
Officer Lucky had him turn around, and I think he was still asking what was going on. Sergeant
Who's he?
John,
Who's he?
the driver,
Go ahead.
and Sergeant Johnson and Lucky told him he was under arrest, and I told him he had a warrant.
Okay, so who said he was under arrest first?
Sergeant Johnson, I believe.
And Sergeant Johnson testified here. You remember that?
Yes.
And after he said that, did Officer Lucky say he was under arrest too?
Yes.
And you heard that?
Yes.
And what did you say then?
I told him he had a I told him he had a warrant.
You just said warrant.
I think so.
Did you specify what kind of warrant, if you remember? If you don't.
I don't think I would have. It wouldn't have been in my normal.
Okay, so what happened after Johnson and Lucky said you're going to be handcuffed or you're under arrest, and you said that there was a warrant? What happened next?
Officer Lucky had him put his hands behind his back, and I noticed that in the driver's right hand was something. It was paper or something, and I took it out of his hand and had it in my left hand.
And you had that in your left hand?
Yes.
And then what happened next? Why strike that? When you did that, I take it you got closer to the driver?
Yes. I reached into the driver's hand and took out what he had in his right hand.
Right hand or left hand?
His right hand, and I held it in my left hand.
Okay. And what happened next?
Officer Lucky started to say something about don't do that, don't tense up, stop doing that. And then it just went chaotic.
What do you remember happening after that?
I remember a struggle with Officer Lucky and the driver at the door. The driver was trying to get back into the car.
Well, he was trying to get back in the car. What did you do?
I went around Officer Lucky as they're trying to get back in the door. I'm between the door and Officer Lucky and the driver. And the driver's getting into the car.
And what happened next?
They're still struggling, and I can see Sergeant Johnson and the driver struggling over the gear shift because I can see Johnson's hand, and then I can see his face.
And you knew Johnson for many years before this, is that right?
Yes.
And by looking at his face at that point in time, what did you interpret it to mean?
He had a look of fear on his face. It's nothing I'd seen before.
Did you say anything when you saw this? What did you do?
We were struggling. We were trying to keep him from driving away. It just went chaotic. And then I remember yelling, "Taser, taser, taser," and nothing happened. And then he told me I shot him.
Can you proceed, or do you?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. After the driver said you shot him, do you remember what you said, or do you? If you don't remember, did you look at the video and see what you said, or do you actually remember what you said? I guess is my question. Not with help from a video.
I don't remember what I said.
And what do you remember next, if anything?
They had an ambulance for me, and I don't know why. And then I was at the station. I don't remember a lot of things afterwards.
Do you remember saying something about prison?
No.
If you did say that, do you have any idea now why you would say that?
No.
Was the climate back then about police officers a little rough?
Objection, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
All right. You don't remember saying it,
No.
and you don't know why you said it.
No.
Do you remember the response that our Sergeant Johnson or Major Johnson gave you?
No.
And when next do you remember what happened, if anything, if you remember?
I remember getting an ambulance, and then I was at the station.
Okay. And you remember being in the ambulance, arriving at the station?
No.
You don't remember the
No.
station?
I remember getting to the station.
Once you got to the station, do you remember what happened next?
The next thing I remember is Officer Fricky was in the room with me
And where were you located? Do you remember that?
in the front office.
Okay. In the front office room, do you remember, were you sitting down, standing up?
I was on the floor.
And after that, at some point in time, did your husband show up?
Yes.
At what time do you believe, from back there, April 11th, at what time do you believe that your memory came back to you?
Probably when my husband got there. So much of it is missing.
After that night, and for the last few months, have you been in therapy?
Yes.
And did you still work as a police officer there?
No,
Did you quit?
I did.
And this was your career?
Yes.
And when did you quit?
A day or two after the incident.
And why did you quit?
There was so much bad things happening. I didn't want my coworkers, and I didn't want anything bad to happen to the city.
And did you own a home in Anoka or Hennepin County at the time?
Yes.
You and your husband?
Excuse me,
The objection is relevant.
the objection is overruled.
Did you own a home, your family home, for years past?
Yes.
And did you sell it?
Eventually.
Before you sold it, did you move out of the state?
Yes.
And do you now live out of state?
Yes.
We have a moment, Your Honor.